it's me, Paper Pirate. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you guys are having a really good day. This is my complete college football realignment, and if I don't sound very excited, it's because this is the third time I've had to film this video due to audio issues, and I had to revise some stuff in the actual presentation. So hopefully this is the last time I have to film this, but I am really excited to share this with y'all because I've been teasing it my past two videos, and it's finally done. Okay, let's talk about why I actually did a whole realignment in the first place. Basically, college football has been broken for a long time, and the issues that have been going on for a while are starting to come to light. First of all, it seems like all anybody cares about is money. Ever since I made the last video, it's come out that like ESPN had a hand in the whole Texas and OU thing, which is so annoying to me. Like, oh, I hate that so much. And then with the NIL, the NCAA is basically worthless at this point. So we have a puppet organization. Everybody's doing stuff for money. And I think that super conferences have a real potential to destroy the sport. Personally, I don't think they're such a good idea. And conferences based only on objective criteria and playoffs based only on objective criteria are, in my opinion, the only ways that we can stop these problems from becoming way worse. There's going to be a ceiling to all of this money and all of this greed, and by the time we reach that ceiling, the sport is going to be unrecognizable. So changes need to happen. I'm not saying that my solution is the only solution or even the best solution, but stuff needs to happen to prevent weird stuff from continuing, basically. Okay, so before I get into everything, a few disclaimers, because it would not be a video of mine without disclaimers. I'm not trying to steal anybody's work. I purposefully tried not to read articles or watch videos so that I can make sure that all of my ideas and thoughts were my own. But in that same vein, it would be really cool if you guys would not share this without my permission, because, you know, that's not very cool. And then this scenario only considers FBS schools that play football. I know on a couple videos ago, a lot of y'all were talking about basketball in the comments, which is fine. Like, you know, we can talk about basketball, but this scenario only considers football. And I actually said that in the other video, but I put it in text instead of saying it verbally, which was my fault. That was completely on me, but I'm saying it here. I'll say it again throughout the presentation. This is only about football. And finally, I'm not a football executive. I am a in between an intense fan and a casual fan, but I just did this for fun. This is how I personally want to see the sport. If you have other opinions, you are free to share those, but this is my realignment, so it's how I want to see it. Now that we have all that out of the way, let's actually get into the realignment. We're going to start with some basic information so that you guys understand what's going on. Okay, basic information. We have a 13-week regular season for all the teams. That consists of 12 games and a bye week, so 13 weeks. We have a 4-round, 16-team playoff structure, 22 bowl games, 10 conferences, and teams are ranked within their conference based off of win-loss percentage. Now, I know some of you guys are scrolling down to the comment section and getting ready to type that you can't rate teams solely based off of win-loss percentage. This is not what you think it is. I would ask you to just watch through the whole video to see what I mean, but primarily it's based off of win-loss percentage because that, again, objective criteria. Okay, let's look at a hypothetical 2021 season timeline. So if this whole system, which I'm going to explain in a second, would go on during the 2021 season, this is how it would play out. So we have September 11th is the start of the regular season. Throughout the season, we have 2 benchmarks, and those are when the teams would be re-ranked based on that win-loss percentage and the extra points that they could possibly earn. Again, we'll talk about that in a second, but 2 basically re-ranking points, and then we have the end of the regular season on November 27th, which is Thanksgiving weekend. That next Thursday, the regular season rankings, playoff contenders, and bowl teams will be finalized and announced. Now, everything is based off of a formula, so you could probably calculate this before then, but this is the date when it has to be finalized. On the 17th, 18th, and 20th are when the playoff qualifying round happens. Then we have the 20th, 21st, and 22nd would be 4 lower ranked bowl games per day. So The 20th would have 4 bowl games, the 21st would have 4 bowl games, and the 22nd would have 4 bowl games, if that makes sense. We have December 27th and 28th are when the playoff semifinals happen. The 29th, 30th, and New Year's Eve, we have 2 to 3 of the higher ranked bowl games per day. January 1st is playoff finals. January 8th is the championship game. And then January 10th are when the final rankings are like set in stone for that whole season. Now, again, since this is formulaic, you could probably figure out before then, but this is when it has to be completely finalized, and the final rankings for the 2021 season would be used to make the 2022 schedule and would be the initial rankings going into the 2022 season. Okay, we talked about rankings, we talked a little bit about the schedule. Let's actually go in depth with rankings and scheduling. Okay, so this is the complete realignment. This was initially going to be the only part I was going to show you guys in the video, and then I created a whole new framework for everything. So this was the original part. We have 10 conferences. They're all based on geographic criteria. We have 13 teams in each conference. Now, the colors don't mean anything. They're just for my personal aesthetic enjoyment. But the shading, I'm not sure if you can tell on whatever device you're on, but it goes from dark to light as you go down. That does mean something. And then the numbers beside the teams' names, those mean something too. Those numbers are the initial rankings, and I'm going to tell y'all how I did those. So first we have, I'll talk about the numbers. It's the win-loss percentage over the 2015 through 2020 seasons for each team. So, all the win-loss percentages added up and divided by 6. I didn't count it against the team if they didn't play for 1 year. However, if they did play in 1-0 games, that was counted against the team. So after that, I put the teams as former Power 5 to former Group of 5, which, going back to the Midwest Conference, is how we have Kansas ranked above Northern Illinois. So obviously, in the context of this 10 conference league, I guess you could say, the initial rankings don't really matter because each year it would be a new, it only considers the games for that season. It's not like a running total, if that makes sense. I just needed some way to organize all of the teams. And obviously, Power 5 and Group of 5 wouldn't matter if this were to happen, but that's just how I initially ranked them. I want to stress that this would have no bearing on an actual season. It's just what I did to rank them. And then the rankings can and would change in the context of an actual season. So let me go ahead and explain the classifications a little bit better to you guys. So the ones at the top, so the darkest colors, so I'll go back. These at the top here, the top 5 are the senior members, and they are the teams that have the 5 teams that have the highest win-loss percentages for that season in the conference. The benefits of being a senior member are priority playoff and bowl eligibility, 1 bye week throughout the season, which everybody gets a bye week, so that's not really a benefit, but whatever, we're going to keep it. You have protected conference and out-of-conference rivalry games. Next, we have the middle, so the not highest but the not lowest. They're the 5 teams in the conference with the middle percentages, and those are the members. They have bowl eligibility, and if something weird would happen, they would have playoff eligibility. We'll go over the playoff requirements here in a few minutes, but if something weird were to happen, they would be eligible for the playoffs. And they also have protected conference and out-of-conference rivalry games, if applicable. Finally, we have the junior members, which are the 3 members in the conference with the lowest win-loss percentages. They would have 1 bye week throughout the season, protected in-conference rivalry games, and they would have protected out-of-conference rivalry games if something were to happen, but more than likely, if they have an out-of-conference rivalry game, they would have to have it in some kind of specific criteria, which I will get into in a second. So out-of-conference rivalry games for junior members are not guaranteed. However, in-conference rivalry games would be. Okay, now let's talk about that win-loss percentage because I already know some of y'all are probably mad. Win-loss percentages are not necessarily the pure how many games you win, how many games you lose, put into a percentage, and that's what you've got. You can also earn extra points based off of minimum requirement games. Now, we're going to talk about minimum requirements here in a couple minutes, but these are games that every team has to play, and they're determined, and you're able to earn extra points if you are successful and win these games. Now, if you're not successful, you can't lose points, but if you are successful, you can earn points. I'm not going to go through all of these formulas because that would take a really long time, but the basic gist is that the lower you're ranked, the more opportunities you have to earn extra points. It's basically rewarding the team if they have an upset. So let's say a junior member just goes crazy and beats their senior member minimum requirement team. They would earn a lot of points. They would probably move up to the member level. Or if they were to meet or beat their out of conference minimum requirement team, they would get some. Basically, if they beat anybody that's ranked higher than them, if you beat anybody that's ranked higher than you, regardless of the classification, and they're your minimum requirement team, you are going to get points. Now, you would only get points if they were ranked higher than you at the time you played them. It doesn't, if they were a senior member when they were designated your minimum requirement team and they fall down to member status, you would get the points based on them being members versus senior members. It's all about when you play them that you'd get those extra points. I hope I'm making sense. If you guys have any questions about this, feel free to ask them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of the scheduling criteria. Now, outside of those rivalry games and the minimum requirement games, again, we'll talk about those in a second. The scheduling is done by a committee which works to create a balanced schedule for all of the teams based on rivalry constraints and perceived competition levels. And they're also going to be the ones who determine the minimum requirement games for each team. Conference rivalries are protected for all classifications. We talked about that earlier when we talked about the classifications. Out-of-conference rivalry games where both teams are members or higher are protected. So let's say we had a team that was a member and another team that was a senior member, or both teams are senior members, or both teams were members. Those games are going to be protected. If we have a rivalry game that's out of conference and both teams are junior members, that's protected. Where we run into some problems is if it's an out-of-conference rivalry game where only one team is a junior member. Those are not protected. They're going to attempt to make that game happen, but it's not guaranteed. And finally, the past 3 years should be considered when scheduling to avoid repeat games wherever possible. Let's talk about those minimum requirements now. The minimum requirement games are 4 games that each team must play every single year that are required outside of those rivalry games. You're going to play 1 senior member in your conference, 1 member in your conference, 1 junior member in your conference, and 1 out-of-conference opponent that will hopefully be on your same competition level. And the minimum requirement games are the games that can add points to a team's final score if the team is successful and the team is ranked higher than the team so if you upset the team, i.e. you beat a team that's ranked higher than you, and they're within that minimum requirement constraint, you can get some extra points. Now, those rivalry games that are protected in conference, they cannot be used to meet those minimum requirements unless there are no other options. For example, let's say you're a senior member, all 4 of your rivals are in your conference, they're also senior members, and all those games are protected. The committee would have to designate one of those rivalry games as your senior member minimum requirement game. Obviously, that would make your rivalry game a little bit more spicy, if you will, but that's the only time that a rivalry game could be used to meet the minimum requirements if there's no other options for you. And finally, minimum requirements are determined prior to the season and remain the same even if a team drops down or goes up a level. So let's say you're a junior member and you get assigned your senior member as a minimum requirement. If they just have a terrible season and they drop down to member by the time you play them, they still count as a member to meet those minimum requirements. However, if you were to play them as a member and you beat them, you would get those minimum requirement extra points as they are a member, if that makes sense. So if they drop down a member, you wouldn't get a new minimum requirement team, but if you beat them, you would get the member minimum requirement points if you were a junior member. The same goes as if you were a junior member, you pop off, and then a senior member plays that junior member who is now a member. Obviously, they wouldn't get any points because if they beat them, they wouldn't get any points because the senior members don't get points for beating the member minimum requirement team. So it's not exactly the same, but I hope that made sense. And I know that was a lot of information, so I'm about to show you guys some sample schedules that will hopefully help illustrate everything that I just talked about. Okay, let's take a look at some sample schedules. The first one is going to be a senior member, and that is going to be Oklahoma. So their conference rivals, these are their protected in-conference rivals, are Oklahoma State and Texas. And yes, I did my best to research the conference rivals for every single team. It did take a while, and obviously I am not a fan of all 130 FBS teams, so I may have gotten some of these right or wrong. Feel free to correct me in the comments, but the gist is basically the same. So I said their conference rivals were Oklahoma State and Texas, which are both senior members. They then have their out-of-conference rival, which is Nebraska. Even though Oklahoma is a senior member, Nebraska is a member, so it works out. They get to have that protected out-of-conference rivalry. And then we have to go into the minimum requirements. I chose TCU as their senior member, SMU as their member, Texas State as their junior member, and Ohio State as their out-of-conference rival. Now, the only team that they would be eligible to earn extra points would be Ohio State, because if I remember correctly, they are ranked above Ohio, or Ohio State is ranked above them. So if they were to beat Ohio State and everything were to stay the same, like they were still above Oklahoma when they played them in terms of the numerical ranking, then Oklahoma could earn some extra points. So that brings their protected and required games to 7. Now, obviously, they have to play 12 games, so we had to choose 5 other opponents for them. And these are a mix of in-conference and out-of-conference opponents of varying levels. So we got senior members, I think we have a couple junior members in there as well. So it's just a mix. Let's move on to Nebraska. Nebraska has quite a few conference rivals, both in conference and out of conference, but they are members, and luckily all of their rivals are members or higher, so they get to have all of their rivalry games protected. Now, they still have to meet those minimum requirements, so they have Northwestern, Purdue, Illinois, and BYU as their out-of-conference opponent, which means their protected and required games are 12, and this is pretty unique. They would have no other opponents, so they're going to be kind of playing a lot of the same people every year. That's just the way some of these work. So I guess lucky for Nebraska, they've got a lot of rivals. Okay, let's move on to Hawaii, which is our junior member example. They have one in-conference rival, which is Fresno State, who's also a junior member, which works out great. But we have our out-of-conference rival, which is Wyoming, and they are a member. So that means this game would technically not be guaranteed for Hawaii because they are junior members and Wyoming is a member, so they're a little bit higher than them. They still do have to meet those minimum requirements. So we have Washington State, UCLA, San Jose State, and UNLV as that out-of-conference opponent. So technically, the protected and required games for Hawaii would be 5 because they still have their in-conference rivalry protected, but that out-of-conference rivalry would not be protected. However, the schedulers were nice and they allowed Hawaii to have their out-of-conference rival in Wyoming, so they would technically have 6 protected and required games as of right now. Obviously, though, the minimum that they would have to meet would be 5. So since we have 6 protected and required games, since we allowed Wyoming versus Hawaii to happen, they would need to have 6 other opponents. And again, these are a mix of junior members, and senior members. So now that we've looked at some sample schedules and gone over the scheduling and ranking criteria, let's go ahead and talk about playoffs and bowls. All right, so as I said before, we have an 8-game, 16-team bracket playoff structure. To get into the playoffs, you can either be one of the 10 conference champions, aka the highest win-loss percentage with the extra points added of each conference, and that automatically gets you into the playoffs. Or you can be 6 senior members and or, in some weird way, a member at large, which is basically the highest season win percentages out of all of the teams. So that has 16 teams. We have 20 bowls filled by highest non-playoff win percentage, which is probably where those members are going to end up. So 40 teams get to go bowling. And bowl matchups are based on the closest win-loss percentage. Again, I'm going to talk about this when you actually see the visual. I think it'll be easier for y'all to understand. Then we have 2 bowls exclusively for the final round, which brings us to that 22 bowl total. The final round of the playoffs, sorry. And then that would mean 18 current bowls are eliminated in real football because we have 40 bowls right now, so 18 of those bowls would be eliminated. We just have too many bowls, you guys. It's kind of exhausting. So I think that 20 bowls is a good amount and it would be competitive. And here's the really important part. Bowl and playoff win or loss would affect your final win-loss percentages, and it would affect next year's initial standings. So you want to make sure you're doing well in the playoffs if you get in, and you want to make sure that you're doing well in that bowl game if you get in. All right, let's take a look at the actual brackets, and I'm hoping that this visual will make it easier for you guys to get it. So the qualifying round. We have 4 rounds of the playoffs, and the first one would be the qualifiers. Now, these are ranked based on the highest, and then you have the lowest. So Utah's the lowest, it's matched up with the highest, Alabama, and then you go second highest, second lowest, and you just keep going down. Obviously, it gets a little bit more competitive or as the numbers get closer, but that's how it works. And then it's at the home of the lower ranked opponent. So Alabama's got to go out to Utah. Georgia would have to go up to Iowa. I think making that first playoff game at the home of the lower ranked opponent can really get the environment going, maybe even charge up the team. However, for this playoff scenario, I just chose the highest ranked teams to make it to the championship. So unfortunately for all of these teams involved in the qualifying round, their at-home advantage did not help them at all. Although I honestly feel like if Boise State went to Death Valley, I don't know how well they'd do. I don't know. It's pretty loud in there. Okay, let's go to the semifinals. This would be at the home of the higher ranked team. So now the lower ranked team has got to climb that hill. And obviously, for all of these higher ranked teams, it, proved well because they made it onto the final. These are where these 2 neutral site bowls would happen. So those are the 2 bowl games that consist the final round on New Year's Day. And then obviously on the January 8th for 2021, we would have the championship game between these 2. And you guys can figure out who would win here. Let's move on to the bowl games. These are all, like I said, matched up by closest win-loss percentage. So based on these win-loss percentages, again, these were used during the initial ranking. So I didn't try and predict who would win or lose at all these conferences, obviously, because the season hasn't happened. I don't know who would win or lose. But I think based on purely win-loss percentages, these would be competitive games in theory. Now, obviously, I think I know who would win just knowing SDSU versus Florida. I think I know who would win, but again, this is just based off of those initial rankings. So this is how the playoffs and the bowls would work. Okay, so I know that you keyboard warriors, if you haven't watched to this point yet, are probably, in the comment section telling me football is not the only college sport, yada, yada, yada. I know, I go to a basketball school. I completely understand that football is not the only sport that colleges play. However, there are so many schools that I just respectfully did not want to deal with all of the schools that are in D1 basketball, all the schools that are in D1 baseball. So I just kind of came up with this overarching criteria. Hopefully all of these other sports, whether it's basketball, baseball, volleyball, softball, whatever, they would be able to fit into geographic criteria. If not, the conferences for specific sports could be created that are based on geographic criteria. The main point I want to drive home, though, is that I think geographic criteria for conference realignment is the best way. And then in terms of like the scoring and the extra points and all this other stuff, I honestly feel like the scoring system could be applied to sports that consist of a single event. So obviously football, it could work for basketball, baseball, volleyball, softball, all that kind of stuff. However, and maybe this is just because I have the Olympics on the brain, but I don't think that the scoring system would work as well for sports that have multiple events. For example, the biggest one for me would be track and field because you have so many different events. I just don't think that a single score for each team would be necessarily indicative of the team's progress. I think you'd probably have to adjust that scoring system for those kinds of sports. And then, in the spirit of continuous improvement, I wanted to talk about some points of revision I have for myself if I were to edit this whole realignment scenario. First, I think that there should be a formula to determine perceived competition level that I talked about earlier. The committee would determine perceived competition level as of right now. I honestly feel like that needs to be somewhat formulaic because it's so subjective. So I'm not exactly sure what this formula would entail. I actually started writing a formula based off of statistics, but I think statistics could be inflated, and then if the teams knew about this, then they may try to inflate their statistics somehow and like maybe lose a certain number of games or like have like a, it could be weird. So I'm not 100% sure how I could make that based on objective criteria, but I would think about it if I were to revise this whole scenario. And then the final thing is, I think there should be objective criteria to determine the other opponents after the minimum requirements and the protected rivalry games have been determined. However, I'm not sure how that criteria could be executed objectively when each team has a different number of protected games. So you know how like in statistics you have like the combinations and permutations? I tried to do that. It went over my head in school. I couldn't do it now. So I'd have to figure out some kind of objective criteria to determine, scheduling. I think that it's just whoever's left gets matched best. That's how I would do it now, but I'm not sure if that's sufficient, and I would try and find some objective criteria to match that. All right, so that is it for the video. I hope you guys enjoy this realignment. As always, leave negative comments, positive comments, likes, dislikes, share your thoughts. I want to know what you have to say. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you guys have a wonderful day and hope to see you soon.